The twist was a great one, an absolute turning point. He was not ready for that. No one was. The dust swirled around Orion Croft's weathered boots as he stood at the altar of the small frontier church, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his best shirt collar. The fabric was rough against his sun-beaten neck, a stark reminder of the harsh reality that had brought him to this moment. His ranch, once the pride of Copper Ridge, now teetered on the edge of financial collapse, its pastures barren and its cattle scattered to the winds by drought and misfortune. The woman beside him, elegant in her simple white dress, had introduced herself as Adelaide Morrison when she'd arrived in town 3 weeks prior with a modest inheritance and a willingness to marry a struggling rancher sight unseen. What the good reverend and the handful of witnesses didn't know was that this marriage ceremony was built upon layers of deception as complex as the canyon walls that surrounded their small settlement. Orion's weathered face bore the weight of secrets that ran deeper than the dried creek beds that had once nourished his land. Hidden beneath his desperate facade lay a web of alliances and betrayals that would soon come to light in ways none of them could imagine. As the preacher's words echoed through the modest wooden structure, Orion's mind wandered to the dusty Rose Saloon on the other side of town, where another woman waited for him with secrets of her own. Lenore Vance, with her auburn hair and sharp green eyes, had been his companion for the better part of 2 years, though their union remained hidden from the prying eyes of respectable society. She understood the harsh realities of frontier life better than most, having built her establishment from nothing more than determination and a keen understanding of human nature. Their secret marriage, performed by a traveling preacher in the depths of winter, was known only to them and the howling wind that had witnessed their vows. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now stood before another altar, speaking similar words to another woman, while the federal investigators he'd been working with for months waited in the shadows like patient vultures. Agent Harrison had made it clear that bringing down Sela's Thorn would require sacrifices, and Orion had agreed to whatever was necessary to see justice served. The man who had systematically destroyed the lives of honest ranchers throughout the territory deserved whatever fate awaited him, and if that meant Orion had to play the part of a desperate husband, so be it. Adelaide's gloved hand felt delicate in his rough palm as they exchanged rings, her blue eyes meeting his with an intensity that suggested she understood far more about their situation than her demure exterior revealed. There was something in her gaze that reminded him of a hawk circling its prey, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The way she carried herself, despite her claims of being a simple schoolteacher from back east, suggested a familiarity with danger that didn't match her supposed background. The small congregation murmured their approval as the ceremony concluded, but Orion couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching from the shadows beyond the church walls. Sela's Thorn's influence extended throughout Copper Ridge like poison seeping through groundwater, corrupting everything it touched. The man had arrived in the territory 5 years prior with seemingly unlimited resources and an insatiable appetite for land and power. One by one, he had forced out the small ranchers, using methods that ranged from economic manipulation to outright intimidation, always staying just within the boundaries of what the corrupt local law would tolerate. As they walked down the aisle together, Adelaide's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his arm, and Orion caught a glimpse of something metallic glinting beneath her shawl. Whatever this woman was hiding, it was clear that she had come prepared for more than just a wedding night. The setting sun cast long shadows across the wooden floor as they made their way toward the door, each step taking them closer to whatever confrontation awaited them in the hours ahead. The small cabin that served as Orion's temporary residence sat at the edge of town, far enough from the main street to provide privacy, but close enough to hear the sounds of evening revelry from the saloons and gambling houses. It was here that he had planned to bring his new bride, in a building that had seen better days but still maintained the rustic charm that characterized much of the frontier architecture. The walls were thick enough to muffle conversation, and the windows were positioned to provide a clear view of anyone approaching from multiple directions. As they crossed the threshold together, Adelaide moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to surveying new territory, her eyes taking in every detail of the modest furnishings and simple layout. She paused at the window, adjusting the curtains with movements that seemed more tactical than domestic, and Orion realized that whatever game they were playing, she was as much a participant as he was. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the room as Adelaide moved to the small table near the fireplace, her movements deliberate and purposeful. When she turned to face him, the demure expression she had worn throughout the ceremony was gone, replaced by something harder and more determined. Her fingers worked at the buttons of her white dress with mechanical precision, but instead of the nervous fumbling of a new bride, her actions suggested someone preparing for battle. "I suppose it's time we dispensed with the pretenses, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present during the ceremony. "My name isn't Adelaide Morrison, though I suspect you already knew that." She reached into her travel bag and withdrew a small vial filled with clear liquid, holding it up to the lamplight so that it caught the flame's glow. "I am Seraphina Thorne, and the man you've been working to bring down is my uncle." Orion's hand moved instinctively toward the gun belt he had removed upon entering the cabin, but something in her expression made him pause. There was pain in her eyes, old and deep, the kind that comes from wounds that never properly heal. "Silas murdered my father 7 years ago," she continued, setting the vial carefully on the table between them. Ezra Thorne was Silas's younger brother, but he had something that Silas wanted: water rights to the richest valley in the territory. When my father refused to sell, Silas arranged for an accident that left my father dead and me orphaned. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place as Orion processed her words. The mysterious inheritance, the willingness to marry a stranger, the way she had maneuvered herself into position, it had all been part of a carefully orchestrated plan for revenge. "The poison," he said, nodding toward the vial. "You're planning to use it on Silas. Tomorrow night, he's hosting a celebration at his mansion to announce his latest land acquisition, your ranch. As it happens, he believes that by marrying you, I've delivered the final piece of his empire directly into his hands." Her smile was cold as winter moonlight. "He has no idea that his new niece-in-law has spent years learning everything there is to know about toxicology and planning." Orion moved to his own bag, retrieving a leather portfolio that contained documents and correspondence that would have meant death if discovered by the wrong people. "Then you should know that I've been working with federal investigators for the better part of 6 months. Agent Harrison and his team have been gathering evidence of Silas's crimes, but they needed someone on the inside to help them build an airtight case. Serafina's eyes widened slightly as she processed this information, and for the first time since removing her mask, she looked genuinely surprised. "You're telling me that this marriage, this entire charade, was part of a federal investigation? The marriage to you was supposed to give me access to Silas's inner circle, yes, but there's something else you need to know." Orion hesitated, knowing that his next words would complicate an already dangerous situation. "I'm already married. Lenore Vance, who owns the Dusty Rose Saloon, has been my wife for over 2 years. She's also been helping to gather information about Silas's operation." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Serafina studied his face carefully, searching for signs of deception, while Orion waited for her reaction. Finally, she laughed, a sound that held more bitterness than humor. "So we're both playing deeper games than either of us initially realized. The question now is whether our goals align closely enough for us to work together." Before Orion could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed from outside the cabin. Multiple riders, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military training or extensive practice. Serafina moved immediately to extinguish the oil lamp, while Orion retrieved his gun belt, both of them responding to the threat with the kind of fluid cooperation that suggested they had found their answer about working together. The horses came to a stop outside, and heavy footsteps approached the door with deliberate slowness. When the knock came, it was followed immediately by a voice that Orion recognized with a chill of dread. "Mr. Croft, I do hope you and your lovely new bride aren't too tired to receive visitors. We have some matters of business to discuss." Silas Thorne's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards, and as his men positioned themselves around the cabin, the sound of their movements suggested that resistance would be futile. Orion exchanged a look with Serafina, both of them understanding that their carefully laid plans were about to be tested in ways they hadn't anticipated. "Come in, Silas," Orion called, his voice steady despite the danger of their situation. The doors unlocked. Silas entered with the theatrical flair that characterized all his public appearances, his expensive suit immaculate despite the dust of the trail, his silver-headed cane tapping rhythmically against the wooden floor. Behind him came 4 of his most trusted men, each armed and alert, their eyes scanning the cabin's interior for potential threats. The man himself was tall and lean, with the kind of predatory grace that reminded observers of a well-fed snake, and his smile never quite reached his calculating gray eyes. "My dear nephew," Silas said, his gaze moving between Orion and Serafina with obvious amusement, "I must congratulate you on your recent nuptials, though I have to say I'm somewhat disappointed that you felt the need to be so secretive about your romantic entanglements." He moved to the center of the room with practiced ease, his cane swinging in lazy arcs as he spoke. "You see, I've recently learned some fascinating information about your domestic arrangements. It seems that the lovely Miss Vance at the Dusty Rose has been telling people that she's Mrs. Croft, which would make today's ceremony somewhat irregular, shall we say." Orion felt his blood turn to ice as the implications of Silas's words sank in. If he knew about Lenore, then their entire operation was compromised. But Serafina stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly, and Orion realized that she wasn't surprised by this revelation. "Uncle Silas," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of respect and challenge that suggested years of complex family dynamics. "I wondered when you would finally make your move, though I have to admit I expected you to be more direct in your approach." Silas's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "My dear Serafina, did you really think I wouldn't recognize my own brother's daughter? You may have changed your name and spent years crafting this elaborate revenge fantasy, but you still have Ezra's stubborn streak and your mother's unfortunate tendency toward dramatic gestures." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, as the three main players in this deadly game finally revealed their true positions. Orion found himself caught between a woman seeking vengeance for her father's murder and a man who had built an empire on the graves of honest ranchers, while outside the cabin, armed men waited for orders that could determine whether any of them would see another sunrise. "The federal investigators you've been working with," Silas continued, addressing Orion directly. "Agent Harrison and his team were very cooperative once we explained the situation to them. It's amazing how quickly a man's loyalties can shift when his family's safety hangs in the balance." But instead of the despair that Silas clearly expected to see on their faces, both Orion and Serafina began to smile. It was Serafina who spoke first, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that seemed completely at odds with their apparent defeat. "Uncle, you always were too clever for your own good, but you made one critical error in your calculations." She moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal the darkness outside. "You assumed that we were working separately, each pursuing our own agenda without coordination." Orion picked up the thread of her explanation, his own confidence returning as their real plan began to unfold. "What you don't know is that Lenore, Serafina, and I have been working together for weeks. The federal agents you think you've compromised, they were never the real investigators." As if summoned by his words, a new voice called out from the darkness beyond the cabin. "This is United States Marshal William Crawford. You and your men are surrounded. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands visible." The sound of many more horses and boots told the story that Silas was only now beginning to understand. His men, who had been so confident in their superior numbers, found themselves outnumbered by federal marshals who had been positioned throughout the area for hours, waiting for exactly this moment. Silas's face went through a series of expressions as the reality of his situation became clear. The smooth confidence evaporated, replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered predator. His men looked to him for guidance, but the sounds from outside made it clear that resistance would be suicidal. "You see, Uncle," Serafina said, moving closer to the man who had destroyed her family, "while you were so focused on manipulating the pawns you thought we were, you failed to notice that we were actually the ones controlling the board. Every move you made, every piece of information you thought you had discovered, was carefully fed to you to bring you exactly where we wanted you." The door burst open as Marshal Crawford and his men entered, their weapons drawn, and their movements coordinated with military precision. Crawford himself was a man whose reputation for integrity was matched only by his skill at bringing dangerous criminals to justice, and his presence meant that Silas's reign of terror in Copper Ridge was finally coming to an end. "Silas Thorne," Crawford announced formally, "you are under arrest for murder, conspiracy, theft, and violation of federal water rights laws. Your associates are similarly charged as accomplices to your crimes." As the marshals moved to secure the prisoners, Serafina approached her uncle one final time. In her hand was the vial of poison she had shown Orion earlier, but instead of using it as originally planned, she held it up for Silas to see before deliberately emptying its contents onto the cabin floor. My father always said that justice should be clean and legal, not tainted by the same methods used by the criminals we're fighting. I spent years planning to poison you, uncle, but in the end, I realized that seeing you face trial for your crimes would be far more satisfying than simply watching you die. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on any of them as Silas and his men were led away in chains. The man who had spent years manipulating others through fear and deception had finally been undone by the very tactics he had perfected, turned against him by people he had underestimated. As the sounds of the departing marshals and their prisoners faded into the night, Orion and Serafina found themselves alone in the cabin that had served as the stage for the final act of their elaborate drama. The lamplight, rekindled now that the danger had passed, cast warm shadows across the simple furnishings, and for the first time in months, both of them could breathe freely. "So what happens now?" Serafina asked, settling into one of the wooden chairs with the exhausted relief of someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. "Your ranch is still in financial trouble. I no longer have a reason to maintain the pretense of being Adelaide Morrison, and we have a marriage that was never meant to be real." Orion poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the bottle he kept for special occasions, handing one to his unexpected partner in this complex dance of justice and revenge. "Well, there's still the matter of Lenore. She's been as much a part of this operation as either of us, and she deserves to be included in whatever decisions we make about the future." As if summoned by the mention of her name, a gentle knock at the door announced Lenore's arrival. When Orion opened it, she stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, her practical riding dress, and the rifle cradled in her arms telling the story of someone who had been prepared to fight if the night had gone differently. "I saw the marshals leaving with their prisoners," she said, stepping into the cabin with the kind of easy familiarity that spoke of long association with both the place and its occupant. Her green eyes took in Serafina with frank curiosity, sizing up the woman who had played such a crucial role in their shared victory. "Lenore Vance," Orion said formally, "I'd like you to meet Serafina Thorne. Serafina, this is my wife, Lenore." The 2 women studied each other with the careful attention of allies who had worked toward the same goal but had never met face to face. Finally, Lenore extended her hand with a smile that held genuine warmth. "Any woman brave enough to spend years planning to take down Silas Thorne is someone I'm honored to know," she said simply. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about what we're all going to do now that our common enemy is no longer a threat." The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night, as 3 people who had been brought together by circumstances beyond their control began to explore the possibility of building something positive from the ashes of their shared deception. The ranch that had been the catalyst for so much of their trouble was still there, still in need of the kind of work that could restore it to its former productivity. Serafina, freed from the burden of her quest for revenge, found herself genuinely interested in the challenges of frontier agriculture. Her education and the inheritance that had been real, despite the false identity she had used to claim it, could provide the financial foundation needed to rebuild. Lenore's business acumen and her connections throughout the territory offered practical resources that could make the difference between success and failure. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the cabin windows, the three of them had hammered out the framework of an agreement that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The marriage between Orion and Serafina would be quietly annulled, allowing the real couple to acknowledge their relationship openly. But the partnership between all three of them would continue, built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than the deception and desperation that had brought them together. "You know," Serafina said as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, "I spent so many years focused on destroying Silas that I never really thought about what I would do afterward. The idea of actually building something instead of tearing it down is appealing." Lenore laughed, the sound carrying the kind of genuine joy that had been rare in their lives for far too long. Building things is harder than destroying them, but it's also more rewarding. And Lord knows this territory could use more people focused on creation instead of destruction. The ranch that had once seemed like a symbol of failure and desperation now represented possibility and hope. The water rights that Silas had stolen from Serafina's father would be returned to their rightful owner, providing the foundation for the kind of agricultural prosperity that the region had always promised but rarely delivered. The three of them, each bringing their own skills and resources to the effort, had the potential to create something that would benefit not just themselves but the entire community. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had served as both the scene of their deception and the birthplace of their new alliance, Orion reflected on the strange turns that fate could take. He had begun this journey as a desperate man, willing to enter a false marriage to save his failing ranch, and he was ending it as part of a genuine partnership that offered more hope than he had dared to imagine in years. The sound of approaching riders interrupted his thoughts, but this time the hoofbeats carried no threat. Marshal Crawford was returning, accompanied by Agent Harrison and several other federal officials, their mission now focused on the administrative details of transferring seized assets and ensuring that Silas's victims received proper compensation for their losses. The legal proceedings that followed would take months to complete, but the outcome was never in doubt. Silas Thorne's empire, built on fraud and violence, was systematically dismantled, and its ill-gotten wealth distributed to those he had wronged. The water rights, land deeds, and business interests that he had accumulated through intimidation and murder were returned to their rightful owners, or sold to provide restitution for his victims. Through it all, Orion, Serafina, and Lenore worked together to rebuild not just the ranch but their own lives. The skills that had made them effective conspirators, careful planning, mutual trust, and the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to longer-term goals served them well as partners in legitimate enterprise. The ranch that emerged from their efforts bore little resemblance to the struggling operation that had once teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Modern irrigation techniques, made possible by the restored water rights, transformed barren pastures into productive grazing land. The cattle that had once wandered desperately in search of sustenance now thrived in an environment designed to support their growth and health. But perhaps more importantly, the three people who had come together through deception and necessity had discovered that their partnership was built on something more substantial than shared enemies or mutual convenience. They had found in each other the kind of loyalty and understanding that makes any enterprise, whether criminal conspiracy or legitimate business, not just possible but genuinely fulfilling. As the seasons turned and their success became evident to the entire territory, other ranchers and business people began to seek their advice and partnership. The methods they had used to bring down Sila's Thorn, careful planning, thorough preparation, and unwavering commitment to their goals, proved equally effective when applied to the challenges of building a sustainable agricultural operation. The small town of Copper Ridge, which had suffered under Silas's influence for so long, began to thrive as honest business replaced corruption and intimidation. The Dusty Rose Saloon became a gathering place for ranchers and merchants to discuss legitimate deals and cooperative ventures, while the ranch served as a model for others who wanted to succeed through hard work and intelligent planning rather than exploitation and theft. In the end, what had begun as 3 separate quests for survival, revenge, and justice had become something none of them had expected. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. They had learned that the same skills that made them effective opponents of corruption could also make them successful builders of the kind of community they all wanted to live in. The trap they had set for Sila's Thorn had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, not just in bringing a criminal to justice, but in creating the foundation for a future that none of them could have achieved alone. As they stood together on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky above their thriving land, they knew that their greatest victory wasn't the defeat of their enemy, but the discovery of what they could accomplish together.